Okay, so our next step here is, I'll be honest with you. A couple years ago in class, I basically just threw out a bonus challenge during my lecture to students to come up with a way, right? It's great to see that we can have all these roles, admin, supervisor, and so on, control, what they can do in the application. But, then how as administrator do you maybe, add somebody to a new role or take them out of a role, right? That's not built in. It's not scaffolded into the controllers and views that we get by default, right? So since I challenged my students, I had to come up with a solution myself, and this is the one that I did, right? I'm not saying it's the only way to go about it, and in fact, you should be aware that later on in the course, we'll be looking at a much more extensive and more professional implementation that also ties in to the other information you would normally track about your staff, employees, whatever, and harmonize it all together. But in the meantime, just so we can move people in and out of roles, this is a nice example of a simple solution to that. So I have my copy-paste file, and I confess I've already got it in the code here. All right, so it was just a matter of copying and pasting a couple things in, so I don't feel bad. You're not going to miss much by missing me bring it in itself, right? So let me just walk through the code and explain it as we go. So just want to mention that when we did this here with our add default identity, especially when we added our roles, right, this we did last time, it does give us the ability to access. Remember, in our seeding of data, we needed two things. We needed a role manager and a user manager, right? So we get them from dependency injection by having this in our program.cs. So to make this work easily, I added, first of all, a couple of view models, okay? One to represent each role and one to represent each user, right? Now, the reason why they make it easy for us in code, let me just point out, we looked at this once before, but if I bring it up in the database here, so for example, if I come to users, let's have a look at the data again. All right. Let me emphasize once more, see the primary key, the ID, is not our typical integer identity. They're all GUIDs, global unique identifiers, right? But there's a number of piece of properties here, piece of information we track about each user, okay? Of course, there's the password hash, and so on. And there's lockout information, phone numbers, and so on. That's mainly for like two-factor authentication, things like that, right? So that's the users. Roles are even simpler, okay? Let me just have a look here. Okay, oh, sorry, this is the user role. This is that associative or intersection entity between the role and the user, right? It just contains the two foreign keys, just as we've done with many other many-to-manys as well. So the roles, this is the one I talked about, okay? So each one has an ID and a name and so on, right? So yeah, that gives us a picture. It's just a typical many-to-many relationship between the user, okay, the role, and then the associative entity, right? But just as with our checkboxes or list boxes, to manage it, we found it easier to create view models first. So my role view model here, the role ID, well, we just looked at it, right? They're these GUIDs, so it has to be a string, okay? It'll store the role name, and just like we did with checkboxes, assigned, a true or false. Are they in this role, right? That's the role view model. Now the user themselves, again, a string ID for our big long GUID to identify each user, and the username, and then a collection, basically a list of the user roles, right? That makes it easy for us in the user interface to kind of show all the roles that the user is currently in. So we add those first. Of course, we don't need any changes to the database. Those are just for our own use as we build the UI, right? So then what we do is we add a new empty controller, right? So similar to what we've done before, right click, add controller, okay, but then choose empty, right? Now I'm not going to do it because I've already done it, right? So that gives me a nice empty controller to start with. So what does it look like? Well, the controller I created here was simply called my user role controller. Remember, keep things in the singular form. First thing that should jump out at you, okay, you should always think about anytime you're adding a controller to your system now, who should be authorized to access it? Well, the only person, okay, in our scenario here, who should be allowed to change the security assignments of who's in what role should be the administrator, right? So role admin. Okay, everything in here is restricted to only people who are in that role. Okay, notice as well, I did make it a cognizant controller because it's useful to know the name its own name as a controller as well. But here we're injecting two things. Application DB context, well, that's just the database context, right? But of course it's focused on the application DB entities, right? Our security entities, okay? And then we have our user manager as well. So remember, that's something that we have available from dependency injection as it's configured in our program.cs. So we need the user manager at the same time. Now, see, we aren't creating any new roles at this point in here, right? So I don't need a role manager. I just need the user manager to modify users. So those, I get those from the constructor, and I'm all set to go. So my index, I will create an index view. By the way, if you put the code in here first, then all I have to do is right click, say add view, to go and create the view itself, okay? And just select an empty view and then put the code in. Or you can try, if you want to, use the view model, but then remember to delete your DB set to create afterwards as well, right? So what we're doing here is I'm going to get my list of users, my user view model objects, right? So for this I go into context.users. Well, that's my actual users inside my application DB context. I'm going to order it by username and then create new user view model objects. The ID we just copy over, same with the username, right? And then notice we're leaving out the last part, okay? From our user view model, remember, okay, our list of user roles. That we'll get afterwards. We first get the basic information about the users, and then we have to loop through them, right? As we do, we'll use the user manager to go and find each one at a time, right? Making sure it's not null. Then I come in here to the user manager, and there's a method called getRoles. Okay, it's asynchronous, and it returns an iList of strings, right? The names of all the roles the user is in. Perfect, that's exactly what we needed. Now the only difference is it's an iList, and I want a list, so that's why we're specifically doing an explicit cast here from an iList to a list of strings, right? And that gives us that third piece of information about the user themselves, right? So we do that for each user, and then we just return that to our index view. Let's have a look at the index view now. If I come down here to views, user role, let's have a look in index. Well, it's a pretty typical, very vanilla, simple index view, right? Just a heading at the top, user role assignments. In my table, I have two headings, display names for, okay, my username and my user roles. And then my for each loop loops through each item in the model, because remember the model is my IEnumerable of user view model objects, right? The ones we just built in code. And so basically we just show the username, and then I just, keeping it simple, I'm just showing the name of each role they're in with a BR tag between, so they'll be stacked on top of each other. Now, we can't create, okay, here or delete. All we can do is edit, right? So we'll have an action link here for the edit action. So back to the controller. Let's look at that now. Okay. Notice we have our usual arrangement of a get and a post, okay, for the edit action. So if it's a get, okay, we pass in the ID of the actual user, right? As long as we actually have an ID, then we come down here, we ask our user manager to go find that user, and we pull out that one user from the security system, right? Making sure that's not empty or null, then we come down here and I build my user view model from the user that came from the database, right? And then we can just copy over the ID, the username, and once more get roles async. So we're doing the same thing we did in the index, but just for the one that we're going to actually show here in our actual edit view, right? Ooh, look at that, populate assigned role data. When we right click, go to definition, of course it's just further down here, right? So this is just preparing the checkboxes. Okay, so we'll have a checkbox for each role. So the concept is very similar to what we've done with checkboxes for many in the past. I have all my roles, my current roles, my list of role view model objects, and I just go through all the roles, determine if they're in it or not, and that decides whether or not the assigned will be true or false, okay, in the role view model object, right? And that gives me my checkboxes. The right ones will be checked, and away we go. Okay, so let's get back up now to the post for edit. Sorry, right here. So we get the ID of the user, okay, and then our string array of the selected roles. Hey, familiar, it's just our checkboxes, which ones are checked, right? Same approach as we've basically done before, right? So we go and we get the user again. Remember, we aren't creating the user. We're only changing how they relate to the roles, right? So we just make sure that we actually have the user, okay? A quick null check there. And then we build our new user view model, pulling the ID and the username. And then we get the roles just as we've done in the past, right? Then we try to update user roles. And if we succeed, then we redirect back to the index action, right? Where it just pulls all the data for all the users and shows it again, okay? An exception, I've never had one yet, but just in case, we're going to have a model state error in case it was an exception, right? And don't forget, if we do need to redisplay the page, we need to populate our assigned role data again. But I'm going to assume that everything's going to go good after we update user roles. So let's go and have a look at the definition of that, right? Again, it's just like our other efforts to work with checkboxes, right? We have our selected roles and the user to update, okay? So we go and we get all the user roles that there are, or that the user has, okay? We find the user manager and making sure it's not null. And then as long as, if the selected roles are null, right, then that would be a different situation, right? If it's equal to null, then we'll just, there's no roles selected, so just remove them, okay? So we just remove all the roles from the user. Just a little for each loop there. Okay, so at least one is checked, so we're down here. So we'll loop through all the roles and add or remove as required, right? So again, it's very much the same approach that we've done in the past. We go through all the roles, basically check, okay, do the selected roles contain it? If yes, if no, etc., etc. Either add to role or remove from role. So again, we're using the built-in capabilities of the user manager to do the actual manipulation of what roles the user is assigned to. And that's basically it, right? Just I have a little dispose here to make sure, because this is my own controller, just making sure it gets, when it is disposed, that our context and user manager are disposed as well. Call me paranoid if you want. Then we just added another link in the layout. Oh, of course I have to log in as admin in order to do this, okay? So there we go. So it's simple, right? I have my 3 users, okay? I can edit, so if I want to make, I'm the admin, so if I want to make the super, I can come in here. I only have 2 roles, okay? But I can assign them to both. Yes, it's a many-to-many, so this user can now be both an admin and a supervisor at the same time, right? I could make the user, okay, a user who's logged in but not in any role, well, maybe I'm going to promote him up to being a supervisor role, right? Okay, and you see how easy it is to make the changes as we've done in the past. So now, one thing, I'm not going to show you the solution, I'm going to challenge you, because I said this did all come from the idea of a challenge anyway. Here I am, the admin user. Should I be able to come in here and change my own? Well, that's a decision that you know, your client who's going to pay you to build this application would decide. But generally speaking, the normal approach is no, right? Users should not be able to change their own role, even if they're an admin, right? So obviously you need to have at least more than one admin in your organization. Otherwise you're stuck, right? If you only have one admin and he can't change his own role, then you know he couldn't make the modifications that might be required, right? But anyway, so you might want to put in some sort of an extra bit of code in there to say no user can change their own role, okay? And that would prevent, you know, even hide the edit link possibly if they're not going to be allowed to do that. But I'll leave that with you as an extra exercise to do. And that's basically the end of this lesson.